The room was chaos. Monitors screamed in uneven bursts, the kind of sound that made even trained professionals break into a cold sweat. 21 of the nation's finest doctors surrounded a single hospital bed, their starched white coats moving like frantic waves in a storm. And on that bed lay Richard Langston, one of the wealthiest men in America, a name that commanded respect in Wall Street boardrooms and Washington corridors alike. And yet, at this very moment, all that money, all that power, meant nothing. His lips had turned gray, his chest struggled to rise, and no matter how many times the doctors shouted orders, no matter how many machines they pushed against his failing body, Richard was slipping further away. Clear. A defibrillator slammed against his chest. His body jolted. For a second, hope. The green line blipped, the sound of life returned, then sank again into a flat hum. Evelyn Langston, his wife of 30 years, stood at the edge of the room in pearls and a silk scarf, her manicured nails digging into her palms. She was shouting at the doctors, demanding answers, threatening lawsuits, insisting someone do something. But the truth hung heavy in the air. No one could stop what was happening. From the hallway, pressed against the wall where no one noticed her, stood a woman who had served the Langston household for more than a decade. She wasn't dressed in scrubs. She wasn't carrying a clipboard. She had no medical degree, no fancy title, no place in this fight. To everyone in the room, she was invisible. But she saw something no one else did. And if you think the story ends here, if you think the richest man in New York would simply collapse under the weight of an illness 21 doctors couldn't cure, you couldn't be more wrong. Because what happened next will not only challenge everything you think you know about wealth, power, and survival, it will force you to question how invisible eyes often see the most. And here's the thing. If a man with every advantage in the world could lose everything in a single night, what chance would you have if something like this happened in your own city, your own family, your own home? That's why you need to subscribe right now, because these stories are warnings as much as they are revelations. And if you miss the next one, you may miss the truth that could save you. So, let me ask you, what would you have done if you were standing in that room? Would you trust the doctors or trust the voice no one else bothered to hear? Comment below and tell me. Because before this story is over, you may discover that your answer says more about you than you realize. Back in the hospital, the air was thick with desperation. Nurses ran in and out, carrying trays, switching IV bags, whispering fears they couldn't say aloud in front of the family. Thomas Langston, Richard's eldest son, had arrived minutes earlier, his tailored suit wrinkled, his tie loosened in panic. But even in grief, his anger spilled over. He shoved one of the doctors aside, demanding why they hadn't done more, demanding why a man who owned half of Manhattan was slipping through their fingers. One of the doctors, voice steady but eyes betraying fear, answered flatly, "We've tried everything. Nothing is working." Nothing. That single word echoed like a curse in the sterile white room. Nothing could save him. Nothing could stop the line on the monitor from flattening. But was that true? Or was everyone looking in the wrong place? Marion Carter, the housekeeper whose presence no one acknowledged, held her breath. She wasn't meant to be here. The Langstons had told her to wait outside, but she couldn't. Something had drawn her in. And now, in the corner where the fluorescent light cast half her face in shadow, she saw it, a detail so small, so impossible that it made her heart pound louder than the machines. Richard Langston's hand moved. Not much, not enough for the doctors to notice. But she saw his fingers twitch toward the nightstand, toward an envelope that no one else in the room had even bothered to glance at. An envelope that would later tear the family apart. But no one else noticed, not yet. Clear! Another jolt. His body lifted, then collapsed back into the sheets. The machine wailed again. Evelyn covered her mouth with trembling hands. Thomas cursed under his breath. One of the doctors pulled a watch from his pocket, his face grim. And in that moment, the moment everyone thought was the end, Marion realized something that froze her in place, something that none of the doctors, with their degrees and prestige, had even considered. Something impossible. And that was the beginning. Marion Carter didn't move. She couldn't. Her back pressed against the cold plaster wall of the hospital room, her hands locked in front of her apron as if even breathing too loudly would draw unwanted eyes. She wasn't supposed to be here. Housekeepers weren't invited into moments like this, moments soaked in privilege and desperation. The Langstons had always made that clear. Her role was in the background, cleaning, folding, fetching, disappearing. But the human eye can only ignore so much, and the human heart can only stay silent for so long. 21 doctors had filled this room, armed with science, status, and self-assurance. And yet Marion could see what none of them could. Richard Langston's hand had twitched again, weak but deliberate, inching toward the nightstand where the envelope lay. Why the envelope? What was inside it? She tried to push the thought away, telling herself she was imagining it. But deep down, she knew better. Years of living in someone else's home had trained her to notice things other people missed. The way Evelyn's smile hardened when the guests left, the way Thomas lingered near the liquor cabinet too long, the way Richard's phone calls dropped into silence when Marion entered the room. She had learned that secrets lived in small details, and tonight, a detail no one else saw was trying to claw its way into the open. "Time of death?" One of the doctors glanced at his watch. Evelyn gasped. Thomas swore. But Marion, she couldn't take her eyes off that envelope. Something inside told her that if anyone in this room wanted Richard Langston dead, the answer might be hiding there. She wasn't ready to move. Not yet. But her mind had already made a choice. This was no ordinary night. In the corridor outside, reporters had already gathered, tipped off by someone inside the hospital. Camera flashes burst against the glass doors. News anchors whispered urgent updates into microphones, the words "Billionaire," "Crisis," tragedy spilling across live broadcasts. New York City was already bracing for headlines. Back inside, Evelyn collapsed into a chair, sobbing into a silk handkerchief. Thomas stood stiff, his jaw set, his anger mounting like a storm waiting to break. The doctors shuffled awkwardly, exchanging glances, some already regretting their presence here. But Marion didn't cry. She didn't look away. She only whispered to herself, words no one else could hear. Not yet. That whisper, so soft it barely existed, marked the beginning of something far greater than anyone in that room could imagine. Because Marion Carter had noticed something that would soon tear open the fragile veil covering this family, and the cost of her silence, or her courage, would be higher than anyone was prepared to pay. She turned slightly, eyes scanning the room. None of them looked at her. Not Evelyn, drowning in grief and fury. Not Thomas, too proud to see anyone beneath him. Not even the doctors, who walked past her as though she were part of the furniture. Invisible. That was how they wanted her. But invisibility has its advantages. You hear things, you see things, you remember things. And tonight, Marion Carter would remember every single detail. The envelope sat untouched. Ivory paper, thick, sealed with a faint smudge at the corner as though someone had tried to open it once before. Richard's hand had strained toward it even as his body failed. Why? Had he left instructions? A confession? A secret? Marion's stomach tightened. This was no coincidence. Out in the lobby, the Langston family lawyer, Harold Price, was rushing through the sliding glass doors, clutching his leather briefcase like it contained the world. His shoes echoed against the marble floor as he hurried toward the restricted wing. He had been called minutes earlier, but the urgency in his step suggested he already knew more than he should have. Behind him trailed two men in dark suits. Not doctors, not relatives. Something else. Marion caught sight of them as they swept past the doorframe. Her chest tightened. They didn't look like men who came to offer comfort. They looked like men who came to take control. And that's when Marion realized Richard Langston's death wasn't just a tragedy. It was a battlefield. The doctors left one by one, their white coats brushing against her arm as they passed, never acknowledging her presence. Evelyn sat frozen, staring into space. Thomas stormed out, phone pressed to his ear, barking orders to someone unseen. For the first time, the room was quiet. And in that quiet, Marian's eyes locked on the envelope again. She knew she had only seconds. If she reached for it now, everything would change. If she didn't, she might never get another chance. Her heart pounded as she stepped forward, and just as her fingertips brushed the edge of the nightstand, "Stop!" The word froze her, cold, sharp, commanding. She turned slowly, and standing in the doorway, briefcase in hand, was Harold Price, the Langston lawyer. His eyes weren't on Evelyn. They weren't on Richard's lifeless body. They were on Marian, the one person in the room no one was supposed to notice. He smiled faintly. "You've seen too much." And just like that, the housekeeper was no longer invisible. "Step away from the nightstand." Harold Price's voice was calm, but it carried the kind of weight that made people obey without thinking. He wasn't a large man, not in stature, not in muscle, but his presence filled the doorway like a locked gate. He adjusted his glasses, eyes fixed on Marian with unsettling precision. Marian froze, her fingertips still hovering over the envelope. Her pulse hammered in her throat. She had scrubbed floors in the Langston mansion for over 10 years, had ironed shirts Harold himself had worn into court, and yet in all that time he had never once looked at her the way he looked at her now, not as a servant, not as invisible, but as a threat. She stammered. "I was just—" "You weren't just anything," Harold interrupted, his tone clipped. He stepped closer, polished shoes clicking against the tile. "You were about to touch something you have no business touching." His eyes flicked toward the envelope. Then, as if remembering Evelyn's presence in the chair across the room, he softened his voice. "Mrs. Langston, perhaps it would be best if you stepped out for a moment. This is delicate." Evelyn, still trembling, wiped her eyes and looked up. "Delicate? My husband is dead, Harold, and you're worried about—" "Please." Harold's voice cut gently but firmly. "Trust me. For now." Reluctantly, Evelyn stood, her pearl necklace catching the fluorescent light as she swept from the room. She didn't even glance at Marian. To her, Marian was still invisible, but Harold never broke his stare. The door closed. Silence settled, thick and suffocating. Harold set his briefcase on the counter, flipping the locks open with slow, deliberate clicks. He didn't reach inside. Not yet. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, voice low enough that only Marian could hear. "Tell me," he said. "What did you see?" Marian swallowed hard. "I didn't see anything." "Don't lie to me." Harold's smile didn't reach his eyes. Richard's hand, the envelope. "You saw. And that means you know something the others don't." Her knees weakened. She gripped the edge of the bed for balance, glancing at Richard's still body, then back at Harold. I don't know what it means." "You don't have to." Harold adjusted his glasses again, the light glinting off the lenses. "You just have to forget you ever noticed." Forget. The word tasted like ash in her mouth. For years, Marian had been told to forget, to ignore the whispers in the hallways, to erase the cruel remarks, to overlook the lies she stumbled upon in the Langston household. But this felt different. This wasn't about manners or status. This was about life and death. And for the first time, someone was telling her directly that what she had seen could not be allowed to exist. Harold's voice dropped even lower. "Do you understand what will happen if you speak? If you even hint at what you saw?" Marian shook her head. He leaned closer, his words deliberate, chilling. "You will disappear. Quietly, without a trace. No one will ask questions. No one will care. Because in this world, Marian, People like you." He paused, his gaze cutting into her. "People like you are meant to stay silent." Her chest tightened. Every instinct screamed at her to step back, to bow her head, to retreat into the invisibility she had mastered so well. But her eyes flicked toward the envelope again, and she remembered Richard's trembling hand reaching for it, as if it carried something so vital, so urgent, that even in his final breaths he had tried to hold it. Silence was safe, but silence would also bury the truth. Harold finally opened the briefcase, sliding out a single folder. He placed it on the counter without opening it. His hand rested on top, heavy and deliberate. "Mrs. Langston will inherit everything," he said flatly. "That's what everyone will hear tomorrow morning. The papers will print it, the banks will confirm it, the world will accept it. But that envelope—" He glanced at it briefly, then back at her. "That envelope could change all of it. And that, Marion, is why you will keep your hands to yourself." He closed the briefcase again with a snap, the sound echoing like a gavel in the silent room. "You didn't see anything. Do you understand?" Marion hesitated. The words wanted to leave her lips, to agree, to submit, to end this unbearable confrontation. But her heart rebelled. Because deep down she did understand. She understood that whatever was inside that envelope was worth more than money, more than power, more than safety. And Harold Price knew it too. The door opened suddenly. Thomas Langston strode back in, phone still pressed to his ear. He glanced at Marion, then at Harold, suspicion flickering across his face. "What's going on here?" "Nothing," Harold said smoothly, snapping his briefcase shut. "Just tying up loose ends." Thomas narrowed his eyes, but before he could press further, his phone rang again and pulled him away. Marion used the distraction to step back into the shadows. Her heart was still pounding, her hands trembling. She wanted to flee, but as she turned to leave, Harold leaned close one final time, whispering words that cut into her like a blade. "If you value your life, Marion, forget the envelope." But Marion Carter knew she couldn't forget. Not this time. The hospital looked different after midnight. The fluorescent lights still hummed, the machines still beeped, but the frenzy of the day had dissolved into an eerie stillness. The hallways were half dark, shadows stretching long and thin against the linoleum floors. Marion Carter walked those hallways alone. Her sneakers made no sound, but her heart thudded with every step. She shouldn't be here. She knew that. She was supposed to have gone home hours ago. She was supposed to have slipped back into her small apartment in Harlem, brewed her nightly tea, and prayed herself to sleep. But she hadn't, because she couldn't forget Richard's hand. That desperate twitch toward the nightstand. The envelope no one else noticed, and Harold Price's warning. "You will disappear, quietly, without a trace." The words still echoed in her ears, threatening to pin her feet in place. But something stronger than fear kept her moving, the certainty that the truth was closer than anyone realized. When she reached the end of the corridor, she stopped. The door to Richard Langston's room stood slightly ajar, a sliver of white light spilling into the hall. For a moment she considered turning back, retreating into the safety of ignorance, but safety was a luxury she'd never truly had. She pushed the door open. The room was empty now. The doctors were gone. Evelyn had gone home under the escort of Thomas, and even the nurses had retreated to their stations. Only Richard remained, still and lifeless under the sterile white sheets. And the envelope. It was still there, on the nightstand, untouched, forgotten. Marion's throat tightened. Every nerve screamed that this was her moment, the point of no return. If she reached for it, nothing in her life would ever be the same. If she walked away, she would never forgive herself. She stepped closer. Her hand trembled as she picked it up. The paper was thick, the kind used for legal documents, no address, no seal. Just Richard's name scrawled across the front in his own handwriting, jagged and uneven, as if written in haste. She slipped a finger under the flap, but before she could tear it open, The sound of footsteps echoed in the hall. Her heart seized. She shoved the envelope into her apron pocket and ducked behind the curtain near the window. The door creaked open. 2 men entered, their voices low. Not doctors, not nurses. Their footsteps were heavy, their words sharp. "Price said it's still here," one of them muttered. "Then check," the other replied. Marian clutched the envelope against her chest, her breath shallow. The men moved around the room, their shadows stretching across the curtain. She could hear them rifling through drawers, flipping papers, pulling back the sheets. "Nothing," one of them said finally. "You sure he didn't take it already?" "Price doesn't make mistakes. It's here somewhere." Marian squeezed her eyes shut, praying they wouldn't think to check behind the curtain. The sound of their search grew closer. The bed, the nightstand, the floor. Then silence. Seconds stretched into eternity. Finally, one of the men cursed under his breath. "Forget it. If he hid it, Price will deal with it tomorrow." Their footsteps retreated. The door clicked shut. Marian let out the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her hands were shaking so violently she nearly dropped the envelope. She had it. But now someone else was looking for it too. She slipped out of the room and into the stairwell, her mind racing. She couldn't take the envelope home. It wasn't safe. And she couldn't hand it to the Langstons, not when Harold Price was pulling the strings. For the first time in years, Marian realized she had power, real power, and with it came danger she had never imagined. As she descended the stairwell, she whispered under her breath, words no one else could hear. "Invisible, they called me, but not tonight." She reached the lobby. The night guard barely looked up from his magazine as she slipped past him, clutching the envelope inside her apron. Outside, the city lights stretched against the night sky. Yellow taxis lined the curb. The wind bit against her skin. She looked up at the towers of Manhattan and felt it. A storm was coming, and she was holding the first crack of thunder in her hands. But what was inside that envelope? What could a billionaire in his final moments have tried so desperately to protect? And why did Harold Price and his men want it buried? Before this story is over, you'll see. But for now, ask yourself, if you were in Marian's shoes, would you open it? Or would you burn it before it burned you? Tell me in the comments, because your answer may reveal whether you'd survive a night like this. Marian didn't sleep that night. She sat in her small kitchen on 131st Street, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound keeping her company. The envelope lay on the table in front of her like a live wire. She made tea, but the cup went cold. She tried to pray, but the words stumbled. Every time she reached for the envelope, fear made her hand recoil. By dawn, she couldn't resist any longer. She slid her finger under the flap and pulled out a single folded sheet of paper. The handwriting was unmistakable, jagged, hurried, but undeniably Richard Langston's. Her eyes scanned the first line. "If you are reading this, I am already gone." Marian's breath caught. The letter wasn't long, but each word landed heavy, like bricks stacking into a wall that threatened to collapse. Richard Langston confessed that his illness wasn't natural. He wrote of treatments tampered with, of poison slipping where medicine should have healed. He wrote that someone close to him had been orchestrating his slow death, not for inheritance, but for something far greater. And then came the name. One name. Someone Marian would have never suspected. Her blood ran cold. She read the line again, her lips moving silently over the letters, making sure she hadn't imagined it. But the name was there, inked in Richard's shaky hand. It wasn't Evelyn, it wasn't Thomas, it wasn't even Harold Price. It was someone else, someone whose very presence in the Langston circle was supposed to be untouchable. Marian dropped the paper as though it burned her fingers. For years she had thought herself invisible, unseen in the grand halls of the Langston mansion. But now, she realized, she had been watching shadows move that others ignored. And Richard had noticed too, enough to trust that she, of all people, might be the only one to see the truth through. Her thoughts spun, colliding with each other in a storm she couldn't settle. She wanted to tell someone. She wanted to run. She wanted to burn the letter before anyone knew she had it, but another line at the bottom of the page stopped her. If you value what is right, find the other half. Other half. The words chilled her. This wasn't the whole story. Richard hadn't just written one letter. There was more. Another piece hidden somewhere else. Her hands trembled as she folded the paper back into the envelope. She stared at it, heart hammering. She wasn't safe. Not anymore. And now, she wasn't just holding a dying man's last words. She was holding a secret, powerful enough to destroy lives. At that very moment across town, Harold Price was already at work. His office downtown was all glass and steel, overlooking the skyline like a throne above the city. He stood at the window, phone pressed to his ear, his voice calm but edged with steel. "She has it," he said. A pause. "Yes, I'm certain. She was in the room." Another pause. "No, she doesn't understand what it means. Not yet. But she will. And when she does, it will be too late." He hung up, adjusting his tie in the reflection of the glass, and then softly, almost to himself, "Unless we stop her first." Back in Harlem, Marion stuffed the envelope deep into the lining of her purse, hidden beneath tissues and loose change. She glanced out the window, her eyes darting across the street. And that's when she saw them. A black sedan, parked too long, the same one she'd noticed outside the hospital the night before. Her breath caught. They were watching. She grabbed her coat, stuffed the envelope deeper, and slipped out the back door. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to keep moving. Because now, with one name on a dying billionaire's final letter, she wasn't invisible anymore. She was the most visible woman in New York, and someone wanted her gone. But here's the question. If you uncovered a letter like that, with one name that could change everything, would you risk your life to expose it, or would you bury it before anyone knew you ever saw it? Comment below, because Marion's choice is coming, and yours may not be so different. And if you're not subscribed yet, this is the part where you should be afraid. Because what's coming for Marion is bigger, darker, and closer than she realizes. If it were you, wouldn't you want to know what happens before it's too late? Subscribe now, because the next chapter of this story is something you cannot afford to miss. Marion clutched her purse tight against her chest as she hurried down Malcolm X Boulevard. The city was waking up around her, buses groaning at the corner, shopkeepers pulling up metal shutters, children tugging at their mothers' hands on the way to school. But to Marion, every sound was sharper, every glance suspicious. She could feel it. The envelope in her bag was no longer just paper. It was weight. It was heat. It was a target painted on her back. Her first instinct was the police. That's what anyone would think, right? Go to the authorities. Hand them the letter. Let the system protect you. But as she reached the station house on 135th Street, her feet slowed. She remembered Richard's words. It's bigger than inheritance. Bigger meant influence. Bigger meant money. Bigger meant hands reaching into every pocket of power, including the police. And if Richard's suspicions were true, if someone had been poisoning him, what chance did she have against people who could pay to keep an entire city quiet? Her hand slipped from the door. Instead, she tried the church. Father Daniels had known her since childhood. He baptized her, confirmed her, buried her mother. Surely he would know what to do. The church was quiet when she stepped inside, the air heavy with incense, candles flickering like watchful eyes. Marion dropped into the front pew, gripping her purse like a life preserver. When Father Daniels emerged from the sacristy, his face broke into a warm smile. But when Marion began to explain, when she whispered about Richard's letter, about poison, about names that could tear families apart, his expression shifted. "Marion," he said softly, almost too softly, "you shouldn't have come here with this." Her heart stuttered. "What do you mean?" He looked around the empty church before leaning closer. Some truths aren't safe to carry, my child. Sometimes survival means silence. Her stomach dropped. His eyes, they weren't comforting anymore. They were cautious, guarded, afraid. And then she saw it. On his wrist, a gold watch. The same model she had seen gleaming on Harold Price's wrist during Richard's funeral. Marion stood so quickly the pew creaked. Her words tangled in her throat. She couldn't stay. Father Daniels reached for her hand, but she pulled back, clutching her purse. "Thank you, Father," she whispered, backing away. "I should go." She didn't wait for his reply. By the time she stumbled back onto the street, Marion's chest felt like it might split open. She had no police, no church, no family who wouldn't think she'd lost her mind. And as she stood frozen on the sidewalk, her eyes darting, she noticed it again. That same black sedan, a block away. The driver's window rolled down just enough for her to catch the faint glow of a cigarette. They were still watching. Her legs moved before her brain caught up, carrying her into the crowd, weaving through commuters, ducking into side streets, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She ended up in a diner on the edge of Harlem, the kind of place with chipped coffee cups and a jukebox no one used anymore. Sliding into the back booth, she kept her head low, her purse pressed tight against her thigh. She ordered coffee she didn't touch, and that's when she realized she couldn't trust anyone. Not the police, not the church, not even the people she'd known her whole life. For the first time, truly, Marion felt it. She was alone. But across town, she wasn't alone at all. Inside his penthouse office, Harold Price set down the phone, a faint smirk curling at the corner of his mouth. "She's running scared," he said. The man across from him, a tall figure cloaked in the kind of wealth that erased names, leaned back in his chair. "And that's exactly what we want," he replied. "Fear makes people sloppy. She'll reveal herself soon enough." They clinked glasses, as if Marion's desperation were nothing more than entertainment. Back in the diner, Marion stared at the untouched coffee. Her reflection wavered in the dark liquid, pale and tired. Her voice cracked as she whispered to herself, "Who can I trust?" No one answered, and for the first time she wondered, was survival even possible? And now, let me ask you, if you were Marion, with that letter burning a hole in your purse and no one left to trust, what would you do? Who would you turn to? Comment below, because Marion's next move will decide whether she makes it out alive. And if you're new here, subscribe right now, because the noose around Marion's life is tightening, and if you blink, you might miss the moment it finally snaps. Marion hadn't slept in 2 nights. Every creak of the floorboards in her apartment made her jump. Every hum of tires outside her window set her heart racing. The envelope never left her side. She kept it tucked inside her purse, which she clutched to her chest even as she lay curled on the couch. It was no longer just a piece of paper. It was her life. But what kind of life was this? A hunted one. Her hands trembled as she held her phone, scrolling through numbers. She thought of calling her sister in Atlanta, but how could she drag her family into this? She thought of mailing the letter to a newspaper. But what if they were already bought? No. If Richard's suspicions were right, if Harold Price was behind the illness that 21 doctors couldn't explain, then hiding would do nothing. Running would do nothing. Marion straightened her back. The only way forward was through Harold himself. The Price family mansion loomed like a fortress on the outskirts of Greenwich, Connecticut. White stone, manicured lawns, a gated drive that screamed wealth and permanence. Marion's cab dropped her at the edge of the driveway. She stood for a long moment, staring at the iron gates. Her reflection wavered in the polished metal. Tired eyes, lines of fear. But beneath it, something harder had taken root. Defiance. She pressed the intercom button. A crisp voice answered, "State your business." "Tell Mr. Price," Marion said, her voice surprisingly steady, "that Marion Holt is here, and I'm carrying something he doesn't want the world to see." There was a long silence. Then the gates buzzed open. The mansion's interior swallowed her whole: marble floors, crystal chandeliers, art worth more than her entire neighborhood. She had cleaned houses like this her whole life, but never had she felt so out of place, so clearly unwelcome. And there he was, Harold Price, standing at the far end of the grand hallway, flanked by two men in tailored suits. His silver hair gleamed under the chandelier. His smile was smooth, too smooth. "Marion," he said, as if greeting an old friend, "you look tired." Her grip tightened on her purse. "Richard trusted me," she said. "He left me something, and you know exactly what it is." Harold chuckled, stepping closer. Richard was a brilliant man, but in the end, brilliance can be a burden. It leads to paranoia, to mistakes. Marion's voice rose. Mistakes? 21 doctors couldn't explain what was happening to him. But he knew, and now so do I. One of the suited men shifted, his hand brushing against his jacket pocket. A gun? Marion's pulse thundered in her ears, but Harold lifted a hand, stopping the man. "Easy," he said smoothly. "No need for dramatics. We're all friends here." He turned back to Marion. His eyes were sharp, calculating. "So tell me, what is it you think you know?" Marion's throat tightened. She could feel the weight of the letter pressing against her side. She wanted to scream, to throw it in his face, to accuse him outright. But something in his eyes warned her. This wasn't a man you cornered without leverage. So instead she reached into her purse slowly, deliberately. She pulled out the envelope and laid it gently on the polished oak table between them. Harold's gaze flicked to it, then back to her. "Careful," he said softly. "Carrying things like that can be dangerous." Marion leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. "Dangerous for me, or for you?" For the first time, Harold's smile faltered. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Then Harold laughed, a low, cold sound that made the hair on Marion's arms rise. "You've got spirit," he said. "I'll give you that. But spirit doesn't win wars. Money does. Power does." He reached for the envelope, and that's when Marion did the unthinkable. She snatched it back before his fingers touched it. "No," she said firmly. "Not until I know the truth." For the first time in her life, Marion saw something flicker across Harold Price's face. Surprise. The housekeeper had drawn a line, and Harold Price wasn't used to being told no. In that moment, the balance shifted. For the first time since Richard's death, Marion wasn't just surviving. She was fighting back. But deep down, she knew this was only the beginning. Because Harold Price wasn't a man who tolerated defiance, and by taking her stand, Marion had just declared war. The rain fell in sheets that night, hammering against the windows of Marion's tiny apartment. She sat at her kitchen table, staring at the envelope in her hands. It was no longer sealed. She had read Richard's words again and again until the ink seemed burned into her memory. He hadn't written much. Richard Price was a man of precision, not rambling. But every line was heavy, coded with names, dates, and one chilling phrase. "If you are reading this, they succeeded. Do not trust anyone with a title, especially Harold." Marion's hands trembled as she folded the letter back inside. She had done the unthinkable earlier, faced Harold in his own home, and she had walked away, but she knew she wouldn't get another chance. Next time he wouldn't hesitate to silence her. She had to act first. The problem was, where could she go? Who could she trust? The police? Richard's words echoed, "Do not trust anyone with a title." The press? Harold's reach spread far, too far. He owned not just companies but influence, editors, networks, sponsors. One wrong call and the story would disappear before it even aired. Marion's eyes landed on a name scribbled on a post-it by her fridge. Detective Aaron Whitfield. She hadn't thought of him in years. Back when she cleaned the old courthouse downtown, Whitfield was the only one who ever bothered to greet her by name. He'd once helped her fix her broken-down car outside the courthouse parking lot. He wasn't flashy, wasn't important enough to be on anyone's payroll, but he was decent, or at least he had been. It was a fragile hope, but it was the only one she had. The next morning, Marion slipped out before dawn, her purse clutched tight, hood drawn low. She took 3 different buses before reaching the station. Detective Whitfield looked older than she remembered, broad shoulders but a tired face, the kind of man who carried other people's burdens home with him every night. He looked surprised when she stepped into his office. "Marion," he said, standing, "it's been years. What brings you—" She shut the door behind her. "Richard Price," she whispered. "I know what killed him." For a long moment, Whitfield just stared at her. Then he motioned for her to sit. "You'd better start talking." So she did. Not everything. Not yet. But enough. She told him about the letter, about Harold's reaction, about the way Richard had begged her, with his dying breath, to keep it safe. Whitfield leaned back slowly, rubbing his jaw. "You're saying Harold Price murdered his own brother?" Marion's voice cracked. "I'm saying Richard thought he would, and now Richard's gone." Whitfield's eyes softened with something like pity. "Marion, do you have proof?" She pulled the envelope from her purse and slid it across his desk. "This is all I have." He unfolded it carefully, reading. His eyes scanned back and forth, his expression tightening. When he finally looked up, something had shifted in his face. "This," he said slowly, "this is enough to start asking questions, dangerous questions." But before Marion could breathe relief, Whitfield's office door creaked open. Another detective leaned in, a younger man with sharp eyes. "Everything all right in here?" he asked, too casually. Whitfield folded the letter instantly, tucking it under a file. "Fine. Just catching up with an old friend." The younger man's gaze lingered on Marion a little too long before he finally shut the door. Marion's stomach dropped. Richard's warning replayed in her head. Don't trust anyone with a title. Was Whitfield safe? Or had she just handed Harold's secrets straight into the wrong hands? That night, Marion lay awake again, her chest tight. She had taken her first step, reached out, risked everything. But across town, in a dimly lit parking garage, Detective Whitfield sat in his car with the letter unfolded on the steering wheel. His face was pale, eyes darting around nervously. He reached for his phone, hesitated, then dialed a number he wasn't supposed to have. The line clicked. A smooth voice answered. "This is Harold Price." Whitfield swallowed hard. "We need to talk." The morning after her visit to Detective Whitfield's office, Marion noticed it first in small ways. The bus she usually took had a man she'd never seen before. Same seat, same dark glasses, every day. The grocery store cashier, who normally chatted about her kids, suddenly looked nervous when Marion handed over cash. Even her landlord, who barely remembered to fix broken pipes, was suddenly asking if she planned to stay long. The air around her felt tighter, as if the walls of her life were shrinking inch by inch. Whitfield hadn't called her back. She tried his office line. No answer. She tried his cell. Straight to voicemail, and with each unanswered ring, the knot in her stomach grew heavier. Richard had been right. She had trusted the wrong man. By late evening, Marion made a decision. She stuffed what little cash she had into her purse, pulled on her worn coat, and stepped out into the rain. If Whitfield had betrayed her, then Harold already knew. Staying in her apartment was suicide. But as she reached the corner, a car rolled to a slow stop beside her. A black sedan. Tinted windows. The rear door opened. Detective Whitfield sat inside. His face was pale, his jaw tight. "Marion," he said, his voice strained. "Get in." Every instinct screamed no, but behind her, another car turned the corner. Same make, same tinted windows, 2 options, neither safe. She slid into the back seat. Inside, Whitfield gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. He didn't look at her. "I didn't have a choice," he muttered. "They've got my son, college loans, his whole future. They made it clear." Marian's throat tightened. "So you gave him the letter." His silence was the answer. Her pulse hammered. "Whitfield, you don't understand. That letter is the only thing standing between Harold and total control. Richard's death wasn't a tragedy. It was a strategy, and you just handed him the finish line." Whitfield's eyes flicked to her, pain flashing across them. "I thought maybe I could protect you, keep you alive until—" A voice cut him off. From the front passenger seat, a man in a black suit turned slowly. Marian hadn't even noticed him until now. "Until Harold says otherwise," the man finished. Whitfield froze. His betrayal was complete. The car drove out of the city, past streetlights, into long stretches of unbroken dark. Marian's heart pounded with every passing mile. This was it, the end. She thought of Richard's words, of the way he had pressed her hand in those last moments. Don't let them bury the truth. She thought of her mother's voice years ago, telling her she was meant for more than cleaning up other people's messes. And then she thought of the envelope. Whitfield had handed over the original, but he didn't know what Marian had done the night before. As the car slowed near a deserted stretch of road, the man in the suit reached inside his jacket. Marian's breath caught, but she leaned forward, her voice calm. "Before you kill me, maybe you should ask Harold one thing." The man paused, curious. Marian smiled faintly. "Ask him if he's sure I only made one copy." The man's hand froze. Whitfield's head whipped toward her. "Copy?" Marian leaned back against the seat, her heart racing. She had nothing in her hands, nothing to prove it. But her voice carried a quiet confidence. "Because if I disappear tonight," she said softly, "someone else gets everything tomorrow, and Harold's empire crumbles in the morning news." The silence in the car was electric. The man in the suit pulled out his phone, thumb hovering. He didn't look at Marian. He didn't look at Whitfield. He just pressed speed dial. A smooth voice answered. "Harold Price." The man said only 4 words. "She says there's a copy." For a long moment, there was nothing but the hum of the road. Then Harold's voice, low and measured. "Bring her to me, alive." The line went dead. Marian exhaled slowly, her chest heaving. She had bought herself time, nothing more. But in a game like this, sometimes time was the only weapon left. The car rolled through wrought iron gates and up the winding drive of the Price family estate. Marian's stomach clenched tighter with every turn of the wheels. The mansion loomed ahead, brighter than the night around it. Floodlights washed the stone walls in a cold glow. It looked less like a home and more like a fortress built to keep secrets in. The sedan stopped. The suited man opened her door. "Out." Marian stepped onto the gravel, her legs weak but her jaw set. She had already survived the car ride. She would survive this too. Inside, the halls were silent except for the echo of her footsteps. Whitfield trailed behind, his face carved in guilt. The man in the suit led her through a set of heavy doors into Harold Price's study, and there he was. Seated behind a vast mahogany desk, Harold looked calm, too calm. His silver hair gleamed under the lamplight, his cufflinks catching the glow like tiny mirrors. He didn't rise. He didn't even pretend to be surprised. "Marian," he said softly, as though greeting a guest at dinner. "I was hoping we'd get here sooner." She stayed standing, clutching her purse. "I told you, if anything happens to me, that letter doesn't disappear." Harold smiled faintly. "Ah, yes, the copy. Clever. You always underestimated yourself, Marian." Her brow furrowed. "What are you talking about?" He leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "Do you think Richard chose you by accident? That he left his most dangerous secret in the hands of a housekeeper simply out of desperation?" Marian's breath caught. Harold's smile widened as though savoring her confusion. No, Marion. Richard picked you because you were invisible, because no one would look at you twice. That was your shield, and your curse. Her pulse thundered. You're lying. Am I? Harold's voice was calm, patient. Richard didn't trust his board. He didn't trust his lawyers. He didn't even trust his own family. But you were loyal. You were ordinary. Or at least, that's what he thought. Her mind reeled. Could that be true? Had Richard known all along that Harold would come for him, and planted his trust in her because she was the last person anyone would suspect? If so, then the weight of the envelope was heavier than ever. She swallowed hard. Why did he die, Harold? Tell me the truth. For the first time, Harold's calm cracked. His eyes hardened. He died, Harold said slowly, because he wouldn't stop digging. Marion's voice trembled. Digging into what? Harold rose from his chair, walking around the desk until he stood just inches from her. His cologne was sharp, his presence suffocating. Into me, Harold whispered. Into the deals, into the treatments, into the experiments. Marion's chest tightened. Experiments? Harold tilted his head. Richard was brilliant, too brilliant. He realized something he wasn't supposed to realize, that the illness he was fighting wasn't natural. Her breath hitched. What do you mean, not natural? Harold leaned closer, his voice almost tender. I mean, Marion, someone made it. The room seemed to tilt. Her knees buckled, and she gripped the back of a leather chair to steady herself. You're saying... She could barely form the words. You gave it to him. Harold didn't answer. He didn't have to. Instead, he walked back to his desk, poured himself a glass of amber liquid, and swirled it lazily. You see, Marion, Richard was never meant to die that way. It wasn't personal. It was necessary. Collateral damage. Her voice rose, sharp with fury. Collateral damage? He was your brother. Harold's eyes flicked up, colder than ice. Brothers are born. Empires are built. Only one of those lasts. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Marion's hands shook, but not with fear anymore, with rage. You won't get away with this, she whispered. Harold's smile returned, faint and dangerous. Marion, look around you. I already have. And there it was, the first glimpse of Richard's secret. But is Harold telling the whole truth? Or is this just another layer of his deception? Tell me in the comments. Do you believe Harold? Or is there something even bigger Richard left behind? And if you're not subscribed, you'll never know what's buried in the next revelation. And trust me, it changes everything. Marion sat in the back of the car again, her hands trembling in her lap. Whitfield sat across from her, his face gray with fear. The suited driver kept his eyes on the road. Harold had let her leave. That alone was terrifying. If Harold thought she was safe to walk out, it meant one thing. He believed he had already broken her. But he hadn't. Not yet. The envelope was still tucked deep in her purse. The one thing Harold wanted, and the one thing Richard had trusted only her to carry. Back in her small apartment, Marion locked the door and bolted it twice. She pulled the letter out, her hands still unsteady. She had read it before, word for word, searching for courage in Richard's handwriting, but this time she read it differently, slowly, carefully, like a woman hunting for what was hidden. The first lines were as she remembered, Richard speaking of trust, of regret, of unfinished battles. His words still carried the ache of a dying man. But then her eyes caught on something she had ignored before, a strange repetition. 3 times in the letter, Richard had used the phrase, "Look to the margins." Marion froze. The margins? Her hands gripped the page, scanning the wide white edges of the stationery. Nothing. Just empty space. But then, under the faint yellow of her desk lamp, something flickered, a faint indent, barely visible. Her breath caught. She tilted the page, letting the light drag across its surface. And there it was. Tiny letters, carved so lightly into the margin that they were invisible unless the paper caught the light at the right angle. Richard had hidden something in the margins. Her fingers traced the shallow indentations, her lips whispering the shapes as she read them aloud. It wasn't a sentence. It was a set of numbers. 14, 22, 7, 3, 19. Marian's mind raced. A code? A cipher? She grabbed a notepad, scribbling down the numbers. The first thing that came to mind was the alphabet. Number 1, B, number 2, C, number 3. If that was the key, then 14, and 22, V7, G, 3, C, 19, Her pencil hovered. NVGCS. Nonsense, unless it was an acronym. A noise in the hall snapped her head up. Her heart hammered. She froze, clutching the paper. Footsteps. Slow. Heavy. Too heavy to be her neighbor's. Then silence. She crept to the peephole, breath caught in her throat. Nothing, just the dimly lit hallway. She pressed her back to the wall, every nerve on fire. Had Harold already sent someone? Did he know she'd find this? The letter shook in her hands. She stuffed it back into the envelope, shoved it under her mattress, and whispered to herself, "Richard, what did you give me?" But as she lay awake that night, Marian realized something chilling. Harold had spoken about experiments, about Richard's illness not being natural, about something created, and now here, in Richard's own secret message, was a code. What if the code wasn't just random letters? What if it pointed to the experiments themselves? NVGCS. She wrote it again, over and over, as though the letters might shift if she stared hard enough, and then it hit her. Not letters, initials, of a company, a lab, a place. Richard hadn't just left her a warning. He had left her a map. The letter wasn't finished. It wasn't just a farewell. It was a trail, a secret carved into the paper itself, and Marian was the only one who could see it. But if Richard left her this code, what would she find at the end of it? And more importantly, would she survive long enough to get there? Tell me in the comments. What do you think NVGCS stands for? A lab? A project? Or something even more dangerous? And don't forget to subscribe, because the next chapter takes Marian straight into the lion's den, and the shadows she finds there will change everything. Marian followed the trail. NVGCS wasn't random. It was an acronym for North Valley Genetic Clinical Services, a private research facility just outside Chicago, one of the consultants Harold had whispered about during his threats. Driving through the night, her hands clenched tight on the wheel, she felt the weight of Richard's letter in her purse. When she arrived, the building loomed, sterile glass walls glowing faintly, guards at the entrance. It wasn't a hospital. It was a fortress. Through whispers and fragments Richard had hidden in the letter, Marian found what she feared most. The billionaire had not simply fallen ill. His body had been tampered with, tested. A trial had been run on him, and Harold had known. She snapped photos, stuffed files into her bag, every nerve screaming that she didn't belong there. And then, a shadow in the hall. Heavy footsteps, voices. They were coming for her. Dragged into Harold's office one final time, Marian stood trembling but unbroken. Harold leaned back in his chair, calm as ever, his voice a blade. "You should have stayed invisible. Do you even know what you're holding? That man was never supposed to live. He was an experiment, and so are the rest of us." Marian's breath caught. For the first time, Harold dropped the mask. He wasn't just greedy for Richard's fortune. He was tied to something larger, something that used Richard as a pawn. And then, Harold offered her a choice. "Hand over the documents, and I'll make sure you disappear comfortably. Keep them, and you disappear another way." Her heart thundered. Every fiber of her body screamed to survive. But Richard's words echoed in her head. Sometimes silence is betrayal. She tightened her grip on the envelope and said, "No." The fallout was immediate. Marian leaked what she had found: files, codes, whispers of experiments buried in the medical system. But power doesn't fall easily. The news barely touched it. Names buried, evidence lost. Harold walked free, untouchable, his smile sharper than ever. Yet something shifted. Richard's family, once blind, now whispered among themselves. His eldest daughter fled the mansion. His youngest son accused Harold on live television. The dynasty was cracking. And Marion? She went back to work. Quiet, steady, always looking over her shoulder. The truth had cost her safety, maybe even her future. But she carried Richard's last words in her chest like armor. One day, what is hidden will come to light. Late one night, Marion found another envelope slipped under her door. No address, no stamp, just her name. Inside, a single sheet of paper. The same handwriting. Richard's. If you are reading this, they know you found the first code. There are more. NVGCS was only the beginning. Her hands shook as she read the final line. The question now isn't whether you can stop them. It's whether you'll survive long enough to try. The page slipped from her hands. She looked at the door. At the hallway beyond. Footsteps echoed. Someone was already there. And that's where we leave Marion, standing in the doorway between survival and revelation, holding a letter that might expose a truth bigger than Richard, bigger than Harold, bigger than anything she ever imagined. But what about you? If you were Marion, would you risk everything to keep digging? Or would you walk away before it was too late? Tell me in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe because this story is far from over.